In the parched outskirts of Elko County, Nevada, where scrublands stretch endlessly and jagged ridges cast long shadows over abandoned dig sites, few could imagine that one of the richest untapped gold deposits in the American West sat just beneath the surface, untouched for nearly a century. The tunnel had no name on modern maps. Its entrance was nothing more than a weathered mound of rock partially covered in rusted sheet metal, collapsed timber, and decades of shifting soil. Most who passed it assumed it was just another forgotten prospect from the boom-and-bust days of early 20th century mining. But what the flash flood revealed in the spring of 2023 rewrote everything geologists and historians thought they knew about Nevada's mining legacy. It began with an unusually strong monsoon system that swept across northeastern Nevada after a winter of heavy snowpack. As the temperatures rose rapidly in April, melting runoff surged through the dry valleys. A violent flash flood tore down the foothills outside Jarbidge, carrying with it entire trees, livestock fencing, and debris from long-forgotten homesteads. In one particular canyon, the water struck a bend in the terrain where erosion had been eating away at a hillside for decades. A massive sheet of compacted gravel and silt gave way, and for the first time in over 90 years, a tunnel entrance, reinforced with crumbling wood beams, was exposed to daylight. Locals who discovered it the next day weren't looking for treasure. They were simply inspecting the flood damage. Among them was Jim Ralston, a 62-year-old rancher whose family had grazed cattle in the region for 3 generations. Jim immediately recognized the aged mine timbers and the unusual sediment pattern around the entrance. It wasn't just a cave-in, it was man-made and old. When he returned the next day with a flashlight and his brother Charlie, the two carefully stepped inside. What they found less than 40 feet in stunned them. Cracked carts sat rusted and immobile on iron rails, and the walls were lined with quartz streaks glittering faintly in the beam of their lights. But the real shock came when Charlie's boot dislodged a chunk of sediment from the sidewall, revealing a patch of dull, yellow metal embedded in quartz. He scraped it with a utility knife and stared at the flake that came loose. It was soft, heavy, and unmistakable. Word traveled quickly. Within days, geologists from the Nevada Bureau of Mines arrived to examine the site, joined by federal land management officials who had jurisdiction over historical mining claims. What they found confirmed the Ralston brothers' suspicions. This wasn't just an old dig site, it was part of the long-lost Golden Caldera extension, a rumored offshoot of the famous silver vein lode that had never been mapped or officially registered. The tunnel had likely been carved by independent miners in the 1920s, who either died in the collapse or abandoned the site without documenting their findings. Based on preliminary surveys, the exposed section alone held over 180 linear feet of quartz-rich veins, many of them laced with visible gold. Because the site lay within federal lands, the discovery triggered a temporary restriction zone, allowing only authorized personnel to examine the tunnel. Over the next 6 weeks, mining engineers and assay teams drilled core samples, mapped the vein structure, and estimated total yield. The numbers were staggering. Using modern sampling techniques and conservative density calculations, they determined the tunnel likely contained over $84 million in raw, unrefined gold, most of it in hard quartz form, requiring specialized extraction. That figure didn't include deeper vein extensions or side shafts that were still inaccessible due to collapse risks. The geological analysis revealed that the vein structure was formed during a period of high hydrothermal activity nearly 12 million years ago, when gold-bearing fluids were forced through fault lines and deposited in fractures within the rock. Unlike modern placer deposits, which are often spread across wide areas in gravel and sand, these hard rock veins were dense and consistent, making them ideal for long-term extraction if proper access could be restored. But before any serious excavation could begin, a team of structural engineers had to reinforce the existing shaft, which had suffered severe damage from water erosion and decades of neglect. Meanwhile, the historical implications of the find stirred a media frenzy. Mining historians scrambled to locate references to any undocumented operations in the region during the 1920s and 30s. Old ledgers, letters, and miners' journals were re-examined. A single entry from a prospector named M. L. Carson in a 1931 field diary described a rich run northwest of the main vein, struck gold, lost the tunnel in the quake. No one had paid attention to the entry until now, but with the newly uncovered shaft matching the described direction and distance from known mines, it's likely that Carson and a small crew had discovered the vein and begun extraction, only to have their operation buried during an earthquake-induced landslide in late 1932. To assess the purity of the deposit, metallurgists performed fire assays and chemical tests on multiple core samples. The results showed an average concentration of 1.8 ounces of gold per ton, an extremely high grade for hard rock mining. One segment returned a staggering 4.7 ounces per ton, suggesting an especially rich pocket in the central chamber. For comparison, many modern industrial mines operate profitably on grades as low as 0.15 ounces per ton. This made the uncovered tunnel not just historically significant, but commercially viable in today's gold market, especially with spot prices hovering near $2,000 an ounce. Despite the excitement, the rediscovery also triggered complex legal discussions. Since the original claim had never been formally recorded, the site defaulted to federal ownership. However, due to Jim Ralston's role in locating the tunnel and alerting authorities, he was eligible for a finder's compensation under Nevada's revised mineral discovery law. After weeks of negotiation, a profit-sharing agreement was reached that would grant him a percentage of the extracted gold's value once commercial recovery commenced. For a man who had spent most of his life working cattle and fixing fence posts, the news was life-changing, but he remained grounded, insisting that the find belonged to the history of Nevada more than to any individual. Restoring access to the collapsed sections of the tunnel was no small feat after the initial geological surveys confirmed the incredible richness of the quartz veins. A specialized team of mine safety engineers was brought in from Colorado to stabilize the entryway. The support beams from the original 1920s construction had nearly rotted away, and the flood damage had compromised the rock face surrounding the entrance. With federal funding allocated for historical preservation and mineral safety, the crew began a methodical excavation, clearing debris, reinforcing walls with modern steel mesh, and installing fresh timber braces deeper into the tunnel. It took nearly 5 weeks of continuous work just to reach the main chamber where the richest ore samples had been found. What the team uncovered went beyond what any of them had expected. As they moved deeper into the shaft, they began to find signs of old, makeshift mining equipment, hand-cranked drills, broken pickaxes, a small ore crushing mill, and even remnants of canvas tarps used as sleeping rolls. It was clear the original miners had intended to work the vein for months, possibly years. But there was no evidence of gold ever having been transported out. The conclusion was unsettling. The miners may have struck the gold, worked it for a short period, and then been buried alive by the collapse, their bodies never recovered, their discovery sealed off by time and earth. That theory gained further weight when a rusted tin box was found near a narrow side shaft. Inside were damp, decayed pages from a leather-bound notebook, most illegible, except for one line scribbled in haste. Loaded the lower cart today. Deeper pocket rich. Must tell Carson tomorrow. Deeper exploration revealed exactly what Carson may have discovered. The vein extended another 45 feet beyond the initial assay zone, narrowing into a dense, vertical fracture rich in oxidized quartz and mineralized clay. In this section, gold nuggets weren't just embedded, they were protruding from the wall in visible clusters. Under the guidance of the Bureau of Mines, a limited extraction test was conducted using microblasting techniques and suction removal to avoid destabilizing the shaft. In a single 48-hour period, over 73 pounds of raw gold were recovered, some of it still fused to the surrounding quartz matrix. Metallurgists confirmed a purity rate averaging 89%, with some isolated pockets reaching over 92%, meaning it required minimal refining to be brought to bullion standard. As news of the discovery spread through mining circles, offers began flooding in. Private mining firms from Arizona and Utah proposed joint ventures. International interest emerged from Canadian and Australian mineral exploration companies. But due to the historical nature of the site and its federal designation, commercial exploitation required approval through multiple regulatory layers, including environmental impact studies and historical site protection clauses. In the meantime, the Bureau granted a provisional license to a Nevada-based company specializing in micro-extraction techniques for sensitive archaeological zones. Their task: to retrieve as much gold as possible while preserving the structure of the tunnel and documenting every phase of the process for archival purposes. For locals, the tunnel became more than just a news story. it became a symbol of the region's buried legacy. The small town of Jarbidge, population just under 100, suddenly saw an influx of researchers, journalists, and gold enthusiasts. The local diner extended its hours. The general store sold out of postcards printed with an artist's rendering of the newly dubbed Carson Tunnel. Even the elementary school incorporated the tunnel's rediscovery into their history curriculum, with students visiting the secured site perimeter on supervised field trips. For many residents, it wasn't just about the gold, it was the reawakening of a story that had nearly been erased from the land. At the state level, Nevada officials saw the tunnel as an opportunity to balance historical preservation with modern economic benefit. In partnership with the Department of Minerals, they launched an initiative to create a museum exhibit detailing the timeline of the discovery, from the original mining boom of the 1920s, through the catastrophic collapse, to the flood that unearthed it nearly a century later. Artifacts retrieved from the site would be preserved in their original condition, displayed alongside core samples, gold or fragments, and digital recreations of the underground structure using 3D scanning technology. The exhibit was set to travel to mining museums across the western United States, beginning with a 6-month showcase in Reno. Yet, even as the site gained fame and legitimacy, rumors and conspiracies emerged online. Some claimed the tunnel had been deliberately hidden by powerful mining interests to avoid land ownership disputes during the Great Depression. Others speculated that Carson himself had survived and buried the entrance to protect the claim from outsiders, leaving clues in letters that were never sent. A few insisted that the government was downplaying the total value of the gold to control public excitement and limit unauthorized excavation attempts. Despite these stories, all evidence so far pointed to a simpler reality. A group of men struck gold, lost access to it in a natural disaster, and the earth held onto their secret for nearly a century, until nature gave it back. Inside the tunnel, operations continued under tight supervision. Each gold-bearing section was carefully mapped, photographed, and documented before removal. The work was slow and deliberate, more archaeological than industrial. Every flake of gold and fragment of rock was bagged, weighed, and traced to its specific location within the shaft. This allowed scientists to build a precise map of the gold distribution pattern, offering rare insight into how the metal had formed and settled over millions of years. Preliminary modeling suggested there may be even more pockets of high density or deeper into the bedrock, but any attempt to pursue those would require full-scale tunneling operations far beyond the current preservation mission. As the months passed, over 740 pounds of raw material were collected from just the accessible portions of the tunnel, yielding a confirmed value of $22.4 million by early estimates. That was only a fraction of the projected $84 million total, but enough to validate the tunnel as one of the most valuable geological rediscoveries in recent U.S. history. Jim Ralston, now working with state historians and mineral consultants, kept his promise to treat the find as public heritage. He refused corporate offers that would turn the land into a private dig site, instead pushing for its continued protection and controlled recovery. For him, it wasn't just about what had been found, it was about what had nearly been forgotten. By late autumn, nearly 8 months after the tunnel's dramatic reappearance, the controlled excavation had reached its final operational phase. The preservation team had mapped and reinforced over 300 feet of tunnel, removed nearly a ton of ore-bearing material, and archived more than 1,200 digital scans, soil samples, and structural readings. Every foot of progress had been documented with precision, but all teams knew the project couldn't continue indefinitely. The original goal had been to safely recover what was exposed by the flash flood and leave the deeper sections undisturbed until a formal geological study could justify any further expansion. With funding tied to historical preservation rather than full mining operations, the window to extract more before sealing the tunnel was rapidly closing. At the center of the operation, a narrow vertical fissure known by the team as the Crown Pocket had become the focus of final extraction. Located deep in a side chamber previously blocked by debris, the fissure displayed an intense concentration of gold-bearing quartz with clearly visible veins, more densely packed than any previously uncovered section. Engineers feared that removing too much from this point could destabilize the tunnel roof, so they relied on ultra-low vibration tools to chip away small sections of or without compromising the chamber. In the final 2 weeks of recovery, over 114 pounds of exceptionally pure gold were removed from this zone alone, bringing the total recovered value to more than $36 million. Still far from the estimated $84 million potential, but far beyond what anyone expected to achieve under the preservation guidelines. As the final days of extraction approached, state officials, historians, and select media crews were invited to view the site under strict safety conditions. What they witnessed wasn't a gold rush, it was something quieter, more reverent. Miners in protective gear worked under soft lighting in near silence, chipping away at ancient rock that hadn't seen light in over 12 million years. The air inside the shaft was damp and metallic, filled with the scent of mineral dust and aged timber. Each time a gold fragment was extracted, it was carefully wrapped, tagged, and logged, before being secured in an armored crate for transport to a secure and safe facility in Carson City. At the same time, the broader cultural impact of the find was beginning to take shape. Educational programs were developed using footage and data from the tunnel. Universities requested access to the site's 3D models for research. Even Hollywood took notice, with a documentary deal signed to chronicle the rediscovery and the mystery behind the miners who never left the tunnel. Meanwhile, geologists began using the tunnel as a case study to reassess other abandoned mines across the American West. The idea that such a vast deposit could go unnoticed for so long sparked renewed interest in re-examining neglected data, old mining maps, and unverified prospector journals that had long been considered anecdotal. As for Jim Ralston, his life had shifted quietly but profoundly. He declined television interviews, avoided national attention, and continued working the same land he had inherited from his father. The only change was a newly built shed on the edge of his ranch, housing artifacts recovered from the tunnel, carefully arranged, labeled, and displayed like a miniature museum. He still spoke of the mine with a kind of awe, never referring to the gold as his, but rather as something loaned by the land, briefly returned before it would again disappear into the record of time. He donated his share of the early profits to fund local schools, road repairs, and a new volunteer fire station, saying the discovery had already given him more than he ever expected. When the final team exited the tunnel in early November, the entrance was sealed temporarily with reinforced gates and motion sensors to prevent unauthorized access. A plaque was installed nearby, describing the tunnel's rediscovery, its historical significance, and the efforts made to recover the gold without destroying its story. The land was left quiet again, the same way it had rested for nearly a century before the flood. Only now, the story had been told. The total estimated value of gold still embedded in the rock remains unknown. Geologists agree that further extraction could be possible one day, but any such operation would require full-scale redevelopment, modern ventilation systems, and years of planning. For now, what was taken serves as a reminder, not only of nature's hidden wealth, but of the fragile line between history and oblivion. A line preserved by one flood, one tunnel, and one family who chose not to chase fortune, but to share it. And so, in the hills outside Jarbidge, the earth closed its hand once more, its secret partially revealed, its silence respected. The $84 million in gold, once sealed away by disaster, had been given back in part, not as a prize, but as a memory, glowing quietly in the dark veins of stone beneath the Nevada sun.